thank you for joining our webinar, Mental Health Stigma in the Asian American and Pacific Islander Community. I'd like to remind you all that if there's time, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you're attending through Zoom, please type your questions into the Q&A chat box. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can just leave a comment. I'm excited to introduce our presenter today, Tanushree Sengupta. Tanushree is a mental health advocate and creator of the Desi Condition. The focus of her mental health work is on the de-stigmatization of mental health in the South Asian community and dissecting generational trauma. Her work largely comprises podcasting in which she scenario maps South Asians in their unique mental health and wellness journeys. She is also a freelance writer and speaker on AAPI Mental Health, and has been featured in publications such as the Zoe Report, Asian Mental Health Collective, Bengalis of New York, and more. Outside of podcasting, Tanushree has a background in medical engineering and industrial design. During the day, she uses her experience to inspire young people to reach their creative potential in STEM fields. She is a full-time high school math teacher and robotics club advisor. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today, Tanushree. You're welcome to get started whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. I think my cat wanted to introduce myself to everybody before I get the chance. I don't know if you got to see her, but I will just share my screen really quickly while I get into a little bit about what we're going to be doing today, or talking about today. Okay, so today, as was just mentioned, we're going to be talking about Asian American and Pacific Islander mental health. My name is Tanushree, and I run a podcast called the Desi Condition, which is a podcast that's focused on the mental health of South Asians, of the South Asian community. But it is also a platform that extends a little bit more beyond just podcasting. I do also, we have blogging, we have features, we have different people's mental health stories, and I have branched out also so that I could talk more about AAPI mental health in general. So that's not just focused on South Asians. This is something that is very near and dear to my heart. I was born and raised in Queens, New York, so very, very diverse population. And so it's really important to me that that I try to reach as many areas as I can in my mental health advocacy. So a little bit about myself. Like I said, I'm a mental health advocate. Talking about South Asian mental health, Desi is actually another word for, it usually implies South Asians, and the word translates to native. And so it implies those of South Asian descent. And I've been featured in a couple of places that you can find me, such as the Zoe Report, Asian Mental Health Collective, Bengalis of New York, and a lot more. Towards the end of the presentation, I will post some, I will have some resources up on the screen, as well as other ways that you can find me, contact me, reach me, and so you'll be able to see that. So outside of mental health advocacy, I'm a high school math teacher. I'm currently a grad student at PACE, getting my master's in teaching for math grades 7 through 12. I also have a background in mechanical engineering and a master's in industrial design. And so teaching is a little bit of a new career switch for me. I've been doing it for about a year and change. I'm also really good at baking, but only if I've Googled the recipes. So that's a little bit about myself. So what is AAPI and why do we care about AAPI mental health? So AAPI stands for Asian American Pacific Islander, and it comprises a very, very large population. Over 100 languages, 50 ethnic groups speaking a ton of different languages, such as Chinese, Indian, Japanese, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, Hawaiian, and other Pacific and Asian and Pacific Islander ancestries. So why do we care about their AAPI mental health? And I think really the question here is, why does it need to be categorized as in a separate category within mental health, right? Why is it like a bullet point within mental health? it's unique. And I think it is unique because AAPI, the AAPI population tends to have the lowest help-seeking rate of all other nationality groups. And according to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are 3 times less likely to seek mental health services than other Americans. And so it does need to be categorized differently because something is going on. There's some reason that AAPI population is seeking help less than any other nationality group. And the answer kind of lies in the word intersectionality, one of my favorite words. So intersectionality is really, I think, the key to understanding why there are so many mental health barriers for the AAPI community. So intersectionality means considering how different factors intersect to better acknowledge the differences among us. So when it comes to intersectionality, people often talk about factors like race, ability, gender, occupation, orientation, sexual orientation, economic status, and more. So some of the things that affect AAPI mental health barriers and some of the things that intersect with each other are all of the things on this item. And this is also the agenda for this webinar. So I'll be going through some of, and this is not at all an exhaustive list, but I'll be going through some of the different factors that do affect mental health access for AAPI individuals. So some of those things include stigma, health coverage, language access, faith and religion, the model minority myth, immigration and intergenerational trauma, barriers to culturally competent care, then alternatives to treatment among other AAPI cultures. And then I will end with some resources that you might find helpful just in case. So I'll start off with stigma against mental health. So one of the biggest barriers to seeking mental health, and not just for AAPI community, but I think for anybody, is the stigma surrounding it. Due to the stigma, there's a lack of knowledge of what mental illness is, and there's a pressure to appear normal and healthy in order to uphold a family image. There is not a lot of knowledge that mental health is actually a health condition, right? Your brain is part of your body, and so your brain also needs to be treated as well as you treat the rest of your body. It needs regular checkups and it needs care. So the lack of knowledge that it's a physical reaction or a chemical reaction to something that is happening. There's a lack of knowledge of how mental illness looks, and lack of awareness of the types of services that are available to treat mental health. So sometimes in the AAPI community, often in the AAPI community, I would say, people tend to seek help from friends or colleagues, the religious community, or their families, rather than seeking actually professional help. The language access is another big barrier that is pretty unique to the AAPI community. So 32.6%, this is a pretty shocking number, but 32.6% of Asian Americans don't speak English fluently. And that number varies a little bit among different AAPI groups. Like I said, there's over 50 different ethnic groups, so it does vary within those, but in general, like the larger, I guess, statistic for Asian Americans is that specifically that 32.6% of them don't speak English fluently. And so that can be a problem if you are trying to seek mental health help, and but you can't find services in your language. So on top of that, about 60% of AAPI individuals aged 65 years or older have limited English proficiency. So that's an even greater problem. But and this is probably a helpful tip to know if you are trying to get help for yourself or a loved one who has limited language access, then you do have the right to receive services in your preferred language. You can request a trained interpreter and receive information about whatever condition, etc., or what your options are in your language if that institution receives funding from the federal government. So just because you might not think that it's necessarily accessible, I think it is always worth at least asking to see if you can find resources in your preferred language. So faith and religion, and I would say this is not necessarily a barrier. It is also something that is very helpful. People, so I'll go through it. So faith and religion, lots of people in religious communities are often supportive of each other. Being religious can provide individuals with a sense of purpose, the sense of connectedness, and with a sense that there's more to life than just material things. And it can help people with their mental health because they are able to look into themselves, they're able to reflect, they're able to practice forgiveness, and find a sense of self, right? And that can bring peace for people, and it can help with mental health. There is also research that suggests that religiosity does reduce suicide rates, alcoholism, and drug use. However, it can pose barriers, just like anything. There is a bit of a darker side to it. It can hinder treatment if mental illness and treatment is stigmatized, as sometimes it is in the religious community. So sometimes mental illness is seen as divine punishment rather than as a health condition. And there are different views among different religious communities or even different pockets within religious communities on psychiatric care and on the need for treatment. So sometimes even if a religious figurehead believes that it would be good to refer someone to treatment, they may be afraid to do so or reluctant to do so because they're a religious minority and they don't want their members to face any kind of discrimination based on their religion. So the model minority. So the model minority stereotype is a myth. The model minority stereotype says that Asian Americans are high achieving individuals with successful, stable careers. They're upstanding citizens. I put the "we're good at math" one because I'm a math teacher, and I think it's a little bit funny that I did fulfill that stereotype, but I don't think it's true for everybody. Of course it's not. And I do disapprove of that stereotype being out there. But I do think it's funny because I am good at math. But anyway, so the stereotype that we're all law-abiding, good at math, we're high-achieving, we're successful individuals, that can be really a lot of pressure for Asian Americans. The statistics that say that Asian Americans tend to have higher salary or higher income compared to other Americans is also usually faulty data that is based off of people from Indian, Chinese, or Japanese descent, and it doesn't account for other countries such as, or people who have just immigrated or descended from other countries such as the Philippines, Bangladesh, Laos, Thailand, Pakistan, and more, so many more. So because of the model minority myth, members of the AAPI community might feel like they need to maintain a certain image of being successful, of being self-sufficient, of being academically proficient. It also is a very dangerous myth because it masks the history of violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, such as colonization, the effects of colonization, internment camps, being blamed for diseases. You know, even today with COVID-19, lots of Asian Americans from East Asian countries, like, they are facing a lot of discrimination and violence against them because they're being blamed for coronavirus. And that's an awful thing that, you know, this model minority myth just kind of erases the fact that any of this violence is happening or has happened during Asian Americans. So it's a very dangerous thing, even though the model minority myth, you know, it sounds like something that is very positive. It sounds like something we want to be associated with. Like, we want people to think that we're smart and kind and upstanding individuals, but that just isn't true for everybody. And you know, it puts a lot of pressure on individuals to try to maintain a certain status and reach the expectations that society has for them. So that can definitely affect mental health. So to look a little bit more into the percentage of Asian children in families with incomes below the poverty level, this data is from 2014, and this is just different cities in the US compared to the US as a whole. So New York has one of the highest percentages of families below the poverty level at around 20% as of 2014. Of course, these numbers may have changed a little bit since 2014, but it's not, the old data's not too old. So, I mean, that's a pretty large number, 20%. And then if you look a little bit closer into how Asians are represented compared to other political groups or other groups politically, Asian Americans are the most politically underrepresented group. So even when we are successful, we don't necessarily hold high positions of power, and therefore we're underrepresented in government. So that can affect the resources that we receive as AAPI folks. So another factor that can affect mental health among AAPI individuals is what's called immigration and what's called intergenerational trauma. So a lot of times AAPI immigrants may not necessarily seek mental health care due to fears that they have regarding immigration status. They may not want to jeopardize their citizenship application process. To talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma, in case you're not sure what it is, what happens is first and second generation AAPI individuals from countries with traumatic histories, even if they haven't necessarily witnessed that violence, may still feel the effects of mental illnesses from it that has been passed down through generations. So the idea is that trauma can be passed through our bodies through generations. So what happens is, and I will get a little bit more into that in the next slide, but I want to talk about collectivism for a second. Collectivism is what happens sometimes as a result of having to live through these traumatic history, going through war, going through genocide, famine, some type of political unrest, whatever it might be. What happens is that societies tend to become what is called the collectivist society. And in a collectivist society, I should say, the people believe that the needs of the group are greater than the needs of the individual. And this makes sense when you think about it, because you're at a point where, you know, a lot of individuals, they may need to band together just to find food, just to find resources for themselves. And so it really becomes more important to take care of the whole rather than to try to think about each individual. So this is a quote that I took directly from from an article that I published a few months ago with the Zoe Report, and I'll just read it out because I think it's really interesting. An emerging field in epigenetic studies, the likeliness of intergenerational trauma and its effects on our psychology and physiology. In several small studies of Holocaust survivors compiled by the National Center for Biotechnology Information, it was found that children of survivors suffer from PTSD, even though they were born after the events of the Holocaust. The study suggests that children of parents who experience trauma may suffer from impaired self-esteem stemming from the minimization of their own experiences in comparison to that of their parents. So I will caveat this by saying that the data from the studies are not necessarily totally conclusive, and there is definitely a lot of talk about it, but the correlation is there. The correlation does seem to be there, that descendants of generations that have been through this kind of trauma, this political trauma, they do tend to suffer more from mental health issues than maybe if their generations previous had not went through such trauma. Whether that is passed down through nature, so biologically, or just through nurture because of the way that their parents or grandparents have raised them, where it's not totally conclusive, but it does seem like there is a correlation that has something to do with nature versus nurture. So it's an interesting thing to think about. And I can talk about my own story. You know, I was, my parents are immigrants. They had to flee India and Bangladesh during the partition and during the war in Bangladesh. And so they were really escaping, you know, famine and political unrest, religious persecution. And so they went through these things. They went through these traumatic things. And that's something that is really difficult to deal with. And so what they did was, as families, they had to band together to become collectivists. And so this ends up trickling down to younger generations. I know I can speak for myself that I learned to prioritize other individuals before prioritizing myself, because that's kind of what I saw my parents and my family doing. And so I felt ungrateful for having complaints about my life, because I thought my parents, my aunts and uncles, my grandparents, they had it much worse than I did. And so that can be a big barrier in seeking mental health treatment as well. So another big barrier is health coverage. So there is insufficient health care. There is concerns over the high cost of mental health care, and so that can lead to lower rates of help seeking and treatment adherence. And of course, this data varies a little bit between different groups, but in general, 7.4% of Asian Americans and 9.4% of Pacific Islanders don't have health insurance, according to the CDC. So this is a pretty shocking statistics when you consider that we're talking about millions of people. You take about 7 to 9% of that. That's still hundreds and thousands of people who don't have health insurance and cannot get the help that they need for their mental health problems. So another issue is, even when you do get mental health care, you may not necessarily find culturally competent care. So one of the reasons that AAPI individuals are so hesitant to seek care is because a lot of therapists don't necessarily have the training to understand how cultural differences may affect a person's mental health and how to create treatment plans that will benefit that specific individual. So AAPI individuals, sometimes there is some anecdotal evidence out there, plenty of it, that AAPI individuals may find themselves in a therapy session just spending much more time talking about their cultural background and explaining that, rather than actually talking about their issues. So the quest for culturally competent care, ideally culturally competent care would look like accounting for all different types of factors. You know, we talk again about the intersectionality and why intersectionality is so important. So it may look like the therapist considering factors such as age, just developmental disabilities, disabilities that develop later in life, indigenous heritage, national origin, racial identity, ethnic identity, gender, socioeconomic status, and sexual orientation. I would add gender orientation, I would add language to that. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can add to this list. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, and these are just some examples. But now, with all the things that we've been talking about so far, we kind of start to see why it's so important that therapy is culturally competent. So this is a quote that I've taken from a social worker, Amy Morin, who wrote an article for Very Well Mind, and I'm just going to read it out. Clients who don't feel as though their therapist understands them are more likely to drop out of treatment early because they couldn't form a healthy therapeutic alliance. In addition to difficulty establishing a therapeutic alliance, a therapist who lacks cultural sensitivity may not use the best treatment approaches. treatment should be tailored to a client's specific culture and other needs. While a therapist may make some recommendations, the client's input is valued and they work together as a team. So I bolded that last sentence because I think it's the most important one, that if you are seeking treatment, you should see yourself not as somebody who just blindly listens to your caretakers or your providers, but you give actual input into what it is that you need. So I think some of the things, and again, this is not a comprehensive list of everything, but some suggestions to think about if you are looking for a provider is to just ask them if they have experience with AAPI treatment. And I would say that this applies for, you can interchange the word AAPI with anything else, right? You can say, do you have experience treating bipolar individuals who are from an Asian background or a South Asian background? You know, for example, do you have experience with treating people who are maybe physically disabled? You can really replace that with anything. Of course, I'm just using AAPI in this example for our purposes. You can ask them if they have training in AAPI mental health and culturally competent care. And you can ask them what they know about how cultural backgrounds can influence mental health and treatment. And then you can ask yourself too, if you were treated with respect and dignity, and do you feel like your provider understands you well and is willing to consider your personal, religious, and cultural background into your treatment? And like I said, you know, you work together as a team, so you're allowed to shop around. It's like searching for a partner, right? You might not settle on the first person. If you do, great. That's a great match. Like, that's a happy ending. But it is fine to shop around. For the most part, from what I understand, therapists understand when a client feels like they need to find a different therapist because they want it to work for you too. So you really have to prioritize yourself when you are searching for a provider. So one of the last bullet points, the alternatives to treatment. So the idea of talk therapy, the way that we understand therapy in the USA right now is usually talk therapy. That's like the biggest type of psychotherapy that we have seen, that we know of. And that mainstream type of psychotherapy in America does tend to have its roots in Western culture. So the question is that always the best answer? At least that's the question among the AAPI community, because traditionally, it's not that AAPI community necessarily doesn't know about mental health. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they do take it very seriously, but their treatments may look different. So for example, the AAPI community in the past has dealt with mental health through methods such as traditional Chinese medicine. India has Ayurveda as their treatment plan, Japanese herbal medicine, Tibetan medicine, acupuncture. There's massage therapy, folk nutritional therapy. There are energy healing exercises such as Tai Chi and Qigong. There is guided meditation or spiritual healing. Those are just some examples, of course, but there are there's no shortage of, yoga. I could add yoga to that list. There's no dearth of alternatives to talk therapy that the AAPI community has discovered that works for them. So because of those, that's also a reason that they may not necessarily consider talk therapy as their main primary treatment, right? But it can be necessarily, it doesn't have to necessarily be a primary form of treatment, but it can be a complementary treatment, right? But the stigma against psychotherapy can delay people or refrain people from seeking mental health care. So I would just like to say that I don't have like a fancy mental health degree. I do, I exist in this space. I blog, I podcast, and I talk to a lot of different therapists. So from what I understand and from what I have learned from the years that I've been doing this is that the best treatment for some people tends to really just be a combination of these things, that they can complement each other along with Western treatments and Eastern treatments. Sometimes people combine them and that is the best thing that works for them. So whenever you're trying to deal with a mental health issue, you know, sometimes it takes time. Sometimes you need to shop around for a therapist. Sometimes you need to try a lot of different methods, and it's going to take some months. Maybe it'll take a couple of years, but eventually you will find it. And there is no dearth of treatment plans for you. It's just a matter of having that grit and make sure that you're being very forward about trying different things, and you're being open-minded about what it is that you need specifically, and putting yourself first. So this is kind of a jam-packed slide, but this is my second to last slide. I wanted to have some AAPI mental health resources that are specific to the AAPI community. Some are Asian American focused, some are South Asian American focused, some are Pacific Islander focused. Not all of them are, I mean, there's a range of things here, right? So there are some resources here that you can use to just read about different mental health issues. There's a couple of directories in here for providers who come from similar backgrounds as you, or who might come from similar backgrounds as you. If you're looking for a specific race for therapists, and then there are resources to find low cost coaching or classes or even therapy. Just kind of depends on what you're looking for. So, you know, I'll leave this up for a second so that you can take a screenshot of this if that's something that you would like to do. Okay, so, and I believe that this will be up on the Facebook Live or on the website somewhere. So you can always revisit this. So this is me. I'm Tanushree again. I run the Desi Condition. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me at the Desi Condition at gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at the Desi Condition, or you can go to tdcpodcast.com. tdcpodcast.com, you will also find resources that are similar to the ones that I had just posted in the previous slide. And there are also a lot of blog entries and podcasts that you can listen to about people who are going through similar mental health issues that any of us are, really. It is South Asian focused, but I have found that there's something there for everybody. And I will also be, if anybody listens to, you know, radio apps, I will be on Ruckus Avenue Radio beginning sometime in September. The specific date has not been nailed down yet, but you can find me there too if you want to listen to the talk show there. Otherwise, it can be found everywhere, basically anywhere that you listen to podcasts. You just search the Desi Condition and you'll find it. And that's it. So I will now pause so that I can take some questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation and for also providing us some resources. And just as a reminder, this a recording of this presentation will be available on our website. So if anyone would like to revisit those resources, they will be there. But it looks like we have time for a few questions. So just a reminder, if you haven't had a chance to send in your question yet, please send it in the chat or on Facebook Live, just leave it as a comment. But I'll just get started with our first question. So someone asked, do you have any tips for an individual who's interested in seeking mental health care, but is worried that their family won't support it due to cultural stigma surrounding mental health?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think first you have to ask yourself how much it matters to you that you get mental health care, right? So if you feel like you really need it, you should probably do it. And I think the idea that we have to tell our families everything that we're doing, you know, there's a level of that in which you need to think first about self-preservation. because you don't want your mental health to get to a point that it's unmanageable and something even worse happens. So I would say, even if it's something that other people in your life don't necessarily agree with, I understand that that could put a strain on your relationship. I'm not a stranger to that, definitely. Similar thing happened to me too. I felt like I needed to get mental health care, and it really wasn't encouraged among my family members. But ultimately, I did it anyway. And I know that's probably not the answer that is like something probably that you want to hear, but sometimes it is really difficult to get that happy ending with your family members. But you know, the plus side, I think, to this is that once you do end up getting that help, your family, your friends, they will start to notice a change in you, and they will start to notice that you are feeling better, and maybe they will come around. You never know.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great tip. Thank you. And then kind of relating to that, another person wanted to know just about with your journey venturing into the mental health community and how you decided to start a podcast and get into mental health advocacy. Like, what was your driving factor to kind of get into this community?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, like I mentioned before, this isn't my full-time job, but I do have a full-time job, right? I teach. So it is it is something that is very time consuming to do this on the side on nights and weekends. I have a pretty busy life, and my schedule just it's very full. So yeah, it's a good question. Why would I spend my time doing something that I don't really need to be doing? But I do feel like I need to be doing it. So what happened with me was that I had been things have been building up for me for so many years. I have what's called persistent depressive disorder, or dysthymia. So I have like a general low-level depression that's always there. It's persistent, and then I'll have episodes of depression. And when I have those episodes, something usually happens. Sometimes I have thoughts of self-harm. Sometimes it's just a really bad depressive episode, and I may not necessarily have those types of thoughts, but I'm having trouble getting motivated to do anything. I just want to spend the day in bed, or I'm not socializing well, things like that, right? I have like bouts of depression. One time I had an episode that just went very, very poorly. I've talked about this on the podcast before, that, and I've written about this before, that I had a suicidal episode, and I had to get treatment for that. I was in inpatient care for that for a little while. So after that episode, I really needed to sit and just reflect on how did I let it get so far, because that could have gone very badly. I could just not be here in this moment, and that's pretty sad to think about now. But you know, I had to sit and wonder, how did I let that happen? And what I realized that is that there is all the things that I talked about before, right? There's the stigma, there's all the different factors, the intersectionality that led me to not want to seek help when I knew I needed it. I knew I had depression, and it wasn't that I didn't know. It's that I didn't want to get the help because I thought that I could do it myself. So what happened for me was that, because I wanted to talk about destigmatization, I realized I really needed to be talking about culture. So that's actually why my podcast is focused on South Asian mental health. And it's not necessarily because I have any kind of preference. It's that I realized there are a ton of people that are just like me, going through the same issues as South Asians tend to go through. And so that's what that is. But of course, I take any opportunity I can to expand beyond just that, to talk about AAPI mental health. But to answer your question, the way that I got into it was realizing that there's so many things that I went through that other people are going through, and that I'm not alone. And so what I wanted to do was create a space for people to come on the show, just scenario map what it is that they've been through, and talk about how they got through it. And hopefully other people will see that they too are not alone, and they might get suggestions for how to approach their families, or how to approach treatment, or just how to reframe their mindset around mental health. And so I am hoping that that is what I'm able to achieve with this mission.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. It's so great to learn a little bit more about your background and how you got into podcasting. That's really cool.
Thank you.
So for our next question, somebody wanted to know if, as a teacher, you think that a potential solution to decreasing this mental health stigma, not only just in the AAPI communities, but also just in youth as a whole, if this is something that you think could start in school and just begun with teachers or, education in the school level?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's actually podcasting that made me realize that I wanted to be teaching, um, because I think that the important thing in life is not knowing all the right answers, but asking all the right questions and knowing how to ask those right questions. So as a teacher, what I like to do in the classroom is encourage people to go through that creative process or that exploratory process, the discovery process, to getting to the main point of the lesson rather than just front loading information. I like for students to come to their own conclusions whenever that is possible. So to answer your question, I do think it starts in schools. I think it starts with the way that I think there's a pedagogy to it. I think it starts with the way that children are encouraged to think and advocate for themselves, and to think independently. I also think that specifically with AAPI youth, like I mentioned before, there is a lot of pressure to be high achieving in school, to have good grades. I know I definitely felt that pressure. So I would love to, as a teacher, I'm not going to say that it's not important to know the material, but I try to find different ways to have students prove that they know the material. So if I know someone's a bad test taker, they'll still take the test, but they'll have other opportunities, like there'll be other projects and things like that. And everybody will get those types of things. There'll be projects, there'll be like presentations, there'll be like extra credit assignments, whatever it is that I can do to differentiate. It's called differentiating learning, to help them prove that they know the that they know the content in different ways, and to take the pressure off of just grades. And while test taking strategies are important, I mean, this is the world we live in, and it's unfortunate, but test taking is important. We can do that in a low pressure environment. I think knowledge is something that is very powerful. I didn't know that I liked school. I hated school growing up, but it's because there was all this pressure on me. So I hope, at least as a teacher, to create a space in which students can explore and discover in a low stakes environment.
That's awesome. It's really cool to hear about how you differentiate learning in your classroom. And I think that just with, mental health affects how students learn. And hopefully that's something that more and more teachers will start to use as people learn more about mental health and how it affects learning. So that's really awesome that you're including that in your classroom and how you teach. But that looks like all the questions that we have for today. So thank you for everyone who joined our webinar today. I hope that you all enjoyed it. And just as a reminder, this will be available on our website starting tomorrow if you'd like to revisit this at all. And also make sure to follow Tanushree on Instagram and check out her podcast. She has a lot of really great episodes and information, so definitely check it out. And a big thank you to Tanushree for joining us today and presenting this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the great questions.